Hello everyone, today we complete our introduction to Hussite Warfare that I started in the first half last week. Today we'll look at the Hussite Wars proper, so the strategy, the campaigns, the battles. Of course, as I explained in the previous video, that we cover every single country, every single people, every single polity in depth as far as army organization, tactics, battles, military units, and so on. In depth, but I make this, say, introductive videos, in fact, in order to provide that sort of foundation if you want to really get to the bone of it and have a broader idea, also from a political, historiographical, cultural point of view, because these are big topics, and in spite of of course, the importance of sort of analyzing them into great depth, of course, it's always important to understand them in diachronic and comparative perspective, without which nor history, nor strictly speaking military history can work, right? In fact, this is a primarily military history content. So just to get straight to the point, the Hussite Rebellion, we looked at the premises for it, how it was triggered, etc. I will post, as always, in the top fix comment all the links to similar topics, the stuff I already done in the previous video last week. But just know that there is a playlist dedicated to the Hussites, to medieval Bohemia, so if you're interested in that, you can check freely whatever you want. I've already made on the whole context. Prague was naturally the main objective early in the revolt. Since this video is about the campaigns of the Hussite Wars, I will not digress much further on sort of the political background of the story, or at least we will do it only as far as certain topics are concerned. Here, the reason for the uprising was dictated by multiple factors, including, for example, the legitimacy of Sigismund of Luxembourg's succession to the Bohemian throne. There was a dynastic versus elective contention. We explained many times how the Central European monarchies were essentially failing, statally-wise, because the oligarchy, the establishment at large, had not been able, in fact, to prevent its subordination to other factors, like other elements of the smaller nobility, etc., that were, in fact, rowing backwards in terms of power concentration, and during the Hussite Wars would actually shipwreck the entire country into submission to foreign powers after having basically raised a good third of that. Now, at the time, of course, things were much more like, let's see what happens, let's fight over this. And we have already highlighted essentially the zealotic and fanatic character of the Hussite movement, as well as its sort of this fragmentation that would lead, in fact, to its demise. In any case, the original uprising, especially as long as Žižka was around, was properly led, right? And we will see now how it went. Capturing and securing Prague would likely encourage support from the rest of the country, and also a broader international recognition of, if not of the Hussites, of the heretical establishment, at least the status quo, let's say, and the at least recognizing the difficulty in having to go at war against a virtually full country at that point. That would put up an important resistance, in fact. The Bohemian kingdom had historically been very tied to Prague, right? Given the size of the country and the general exposure to Western, mostly German politics and culture, it had been relatively easy to concentrate enough power in Prague, right? This is a more compact country. There are other centers around that are actually difficult to control, but there hadn't been much of, I don't know, like in Poland, like not the secession, but at least the centrifugal escape of different elements acting a bit as principalities on their own, maybe recompacting by cooptation and other dynamics into some sort of recognizably regional power. So it was, given the local resources, of course, challenging to take over Prague. But once succeeding, things would have been much easier, to say the least. Right? The system depended on Prague at large. And in fact, the main centers traditionally aligned with the capital, which was also the proof of the generally, functional profile that the kingdom had had up to this point. Unfortunately for the Hussites, at the beginning of the war, Sigismund of Luxembourg retained control of the two most important castles within the city, the Razzani and Vyšehrad, which meant that the city was at large, like with the higher part, and also this lower suburb on the river, in the hands of the emperor and king. It was difficult to dislodge him from there, because we saw it in other videos about medieval siege warfare. Like, if properly supplied and manned, even a relatively small garrison could hold out. These were pretty good fortresses against much larger forces. So that even if you besieged these castles, you would essentially trigger a hornet nest unloading itself on you, which is in fact what happens against the Hussites. In 1419, Sigismund himself led a formidable crusading force into Bohemia, laying siege to Prague herself, which prompted a call for assistance from Žižka. And the reason why he besieged Prague is that also the city had fundamentally shifted aside and decided, in spite of this fortresses held by the king, to in fact give them a tough time. And that's what actually prompts the rise of Žižka as well. Now, the numbers. Today we will not make a fully strategic analysis of the Hussite wars. At large, it can be considered as such, but as you know, every campaign is different, every battle is different. So without a map, without details, without hours for each campaign, at least, like, you can't even introduce the wall. But when you read things like, there were 80,000, 100,000 German crusaders or stuff like that, just know that there was none of this during the Hussite War. You often find, in legitimate historiography, there's no such thing. At most, in the largest engagements, these forces would have counted 20,000. Some say 30,000, which is really the maximum, but in Central Europe at this point in history, especially after the Black Death, etc., and during this devastated scenario, you don't even have properly the logistical means to sustain such forces. We'll talk later about also the Bohemian numbers they were almost always, in fact, lesser than their enemies, sometimes also multiple times, but the most glamorous Hussite victories, at least in that kind of numerical ratio, come when these battles were smaller, as it's typical, right? The smaller the battle, the sort of weirder the outcome can be, driving away from a random statistic, let's say, average. And when we look at the bigger battles, these are actually the more important, but the outcome can be, in fact, will be more important, because for such a larger army, much more has been invested. But at the same time, the odds are much more balanced. In fact, this notions, again, of armies of hundreds, it's complete fantasy, and it did not exist at the time. The Hussites at a point would count 20,000 men, even more. Like, if you look at the last showdown between the radicals and the moderates, supported by the Catholics, by the way, you have something like 12,000 versus 13,000. So of course, yes, larger. In that case, there are two different armies, of course. But looking at Bohemia as a whole, and also the capacity of the surrounding countries like Hungary or Germany to field an army hundreds of kilometers inland, an enemy, a hostile territory, in the beginning of the 15th century, in this very theater, like of Central Europe, is unlikely that anything more than 20,000 could even be intelligently conceived to be tried to be fielded. In any case, we do know this. I mean, there's not a guess. We're not. This theater is not overwhelmingly documented. As a matter of fact, the Hussite Wars, as we've also seen in different battles that we covered, are based really on some narrative sources that are relatively simple. Like most chronicles of the time really were. There's not this surgically anatomical dissection that you can make if you really dig more, like how actually was. No, we just rely on those accounts, and that's basically it. And we know very few about the whole picture. There are also lots of legends actually that developed over the Hussites that are very anecdotal, such as the fact, for example, that they invaded Hungary at large. It's not like that some forces would have not done it to trigger Sigismund or something like that, but it's like also the anecdote of the Wagenburg being able to envelope the enemy as a snake, just in the fantasy of an enemy of the Hussites, by the way, that was depicting them as that capably evil, or evilly capable in many ways, that is an Silvius Piccolomini, that we already discussed in the video, in fact, about Hussite tactics, that also in the previous one I've been quite clear about. Yes, the Hussites are, at least for the kind of weird last couple of generations revival in Anglo-American historiography, dramatically and drastically overrated. In pop culture, in the general understanding of the importance of the Hussite contribution to the art of war, it was practically null. And that is to say, it was equal to the one that you would expect, like the rest of Central Europe, right? They were pretty darn good at what they did, but it's not like that the system was particularly, innovative or more advanced or essentially divergent from the one of the other. The idea of non-conventionality, this notion that everything changed because there were infantrymen fighting against knights, already seen elsewhere, already practiced elsewhere, and still not, in fact, being the definitive card, and this time in history, and also like properly the Hussite legacy. It's mostly an ideological one. It's one of general, attack against constituted order, essentially Protestant anti-establishment behavior that would spread in Germany, also because lots of Hussites took refuge there after practically their cause was lost, especially the radicals, right? Because at least there was also, as you know, a Hussite king. We will see it later. But it was, of course, a very different story. You can't be a Hussite if you want to actually rule a country, right? You can't be that radical like the Táborites, the Oberdites, the Adamites. The latter are literally communistic ideologies, right? We know it pretty well, by the way. So this romanticism is, especially if you like Czech history, if you like medieval Bohemian history, like there is so much about Bohemian warfare that I also covered at some point. It is so beautiful and underrated, especially as I have that bias for Ottokar II that also failed in many ways, but it was so grandiose in that case that it really deserves, like, I think the most interested, the prize for most interesting topic of medieval Bohemian warfare that also has lots of others, and surely the Hussites belong to them, but let's treat them for what they were, not for what we want to project for some weird, strange, technologistic, progressistic reasons that were not even thought at the time. In any case, we get to Sigismund striking against the Hussites that have basically taken over Prague and are in a context of civil war where you have still, of course, supporters of Sigismund, and this battle is essentially aimed at getting everything over with, putting the rebellion down. The Crusader army was probably about 20,000, which is already a relatively high estimate, and we think that the hill that is located just outside the city and vital for its supply route where the Hussites had also entrenched themselves was assaulted by 7,000-8,000 Crusaders, which makes sense because they're roughly 1/3 of the wall force, and so in terms of strategic reserves, it does make a lot of sense. Like, you send them in, but it's not like you're going to get your army annihilated simply just trying this very difficult task. It's not even like the Hussites were much less. The highest estimates put the Hussite defenders inside Prague at 12,000. They may have been less themselves, and it's also difficult to understand who's probably a professional soldier that could, say, take on probably a German knight or just like some kind of professional retinue, and just say civil supporter lent to this more military dimension, which, as you know, so during the Middle Ages is not quite a distinction, but say between professional and non-professional, especially considering how essentially professional warfare was by the 15th century, with a disarmament of the vast majority of the population, at a time much greater functionalization for the maintaining of a contained but at least elite functional force. In any case, we will see all these battles, because these are very, very famous. The Battle of Vitkov Hill, just like Lipany, Kutná, etc. Now, Žižka on that occasion shown for his, of course, leadership and strategic acumen. He led a vigorous counterattack after having, say, fatigued the enemy that tried to attack at waves, in fact, the Hussite position. And he completes this masterpiece by a second strike against the German flank that, in fact, successfully repels the Crusaders. This is also a general strategic principle. Flank attacks are pretty universal. Like what is done here with this in a large battle, example of large-scale confrontations with balanced odds. You basically, fight with pretty bulky forces that can just do that much. Like, there aren't many options, but with surgical tools, if you are, capable of handling them, if you're lucky, if you have really the opportunity to use them, can shift the balance and make the enemy crumble. Although the Crusaders withdrew with relatively few casualties at the end of the day, their morale were severely impacted, considering that this was a holy enterprise, that Sigismund's effort at large from a financial point of view had been enormous at this point. Like, just fielding an army of tens of thousands of soldiers was really, really impressive, moving them from Hungary, from Germany. A reason for which, within a month, the invading army dispersed, and Sigismund's diplomatic efforts to suppress the revolt ultimately proved unsuccessful. There were continuous negotiations with all parties involved, but the political consequence of the strategic outcome of Vitkov Hill had now consolidated the Hussite presence in Bohemia and secured especially its more important center. In fact, at this point, Žižka worked to take control over the rest of the country. He traveled to Tábor, that was notoriously the cradle of the most fanatic anti-establishment position, and in fact hotbed of the Hussite revolt, and probably heretical ideology, to eliminate the Luxembourg's supporters from the south of the kingdom. In 1420, Czech and German royalist forces assembled, putting together an apparently larger force, probably the same scale at least that we've seen at Vitkov, launching yet another offensive against Žižka at Bor Pansky in southwestern Bohemia, so still threatening essentially the main center of power, also directionally. So, many of them came from the southwest against the Hussites. This also shows, in interest of time, how pressured the Luxembourgs and their supporters were to recover control in Bohemia. In all of this, like what is happening is shocking from a political, international, ideological point of view. Consider that this movement was not just, a Czech thing or just pertaining to this specific national theater. Sigismund officially paralleled the supporters of Wycliffe in England to the Czech Hussites, right? The the universal authorities were equating these heretics as a wall force, cooperating, right, coordinated in Europe against constituted order. And this is such a critical moment. Like, imagine, like, the narrative is, okay, let's, aside from the strictly ideological implications, the content of the Hussite heresy and the actual political merits that it could have had, that, you know, as you know, brought to a complete disaster for them, for the country, for, like, everything that they were allegedly fighting for, or at least trying to get. The climate of power disruption in medieval civilization here is immense, right? This is not a glorious, happy moment in which something new was being born. No, this was one of the darkest times ever. The 15th century is actually a pretty tragic century, just like the 16th, but imagine what we have made of the Renaissance in general, and also at least in a teleological progressistic idea of, you know, increased individual liberty. No, right? This is valid also for the Hussites. They eventually lost and went down, and they lost liberty. Like, in early modern Europe witnesses a much lower individual liberty than the later Middle Ages, as a matter of fact. And actually here, the Hussites are fighting exactly in theory to avoid that, except their broader moral, political, cultural background does not allow them really to, in fact, put together nothing but a very ferocious fight that, however, destroys them and the country, in their country in the process. Now, in this second attack, despite multiple cavalry charges, the Crusaders were once again unable to displace Žižka from his picked position at Bord Pansky. After fierce fighting, he remained victorious on the battlefield. This stemmed at large from a broader siege, so consider that aside from the major showdowns, this warfare was made of, and this is typical of the 15th century, of a lot of field fortifications, a lot of very technically also, at least advanced. Here the resources are scarce, but artillery, like a more professional soldier, it was all needed for this very heavy type of warfare. As a result of this defeat, the royalists in the south and the east of the kingdom could not support Sigismund anymore, so that the 1420 campaign should have reversed. In fact, the odds ends in disaster, and also had the stale strike aiming at trying to recover Prague in some way that also fails, sealing the general situation from a political and strategical point of view. But, and here where you realize also the many qualities of Žižka, he did not simply rest on the laurels. During the winter of 1420-21, which is normally a time of, you know, military inactivity, list of troops resting in their winter lodging, etc., or disbanding, because that's mostly what this uprising had been about. Popular background, of course, backing some, you know, elite forces, but at large not having really the sound compaction of a fully established kingdom that really can also maintain much control on the entire realm. In fact, for this reason, Žižka advances on the royalist town of Pilsen, famous for beer, but of course, like being a very important medieval town in Bohemia, quickly severing its lines of communication, especially with the German allies. Right, Pilsen, as you know, is in the essentially southeast, and that is exposed, of course, to infiltration in the country. Because normally, again, you have Prague now, but the major problems that had ever been given within the kingdom, like in terms of mostly nobiliary position or any other counter establishment movement, was the southeast. Right, it was a bit like there was Moravia, that behaves in a bit of a different way. Žižka's threat to this pivotal royalist stronghold forced Sigismund to respond by bringing in further German support. However, Žižka's forces had been considerably weakened due to the necessity of garrisoning captured strongholds. Siege warfare can be extremely outwearing, let's say, and exhausting, allowing him to at least evade confrontation and return to Tábor to assemble reinforcements, because he could not really meet with the Germans in open field at that point. It was never much about open field, but was always cleverly about this, again, more fortified defensive positions at large, because yes, the Crusader forces were stronger, right? The only way to cope with them was not much an open field confrontation, but in fact this kind of means. It's also, for this, the Hussites really followed the general strategic principles of the time. This is exactly what the English do against the French. It's not that they had found another way to wage war just per se. At least they will adopt it routinely, but only because they were normally strategically inferior to their opponents, were many more. And so if you have to confront, I don't know, a cavalry charge that destroys your force, you prefer at that point to exploit instead the tactical advantages of defense, renouncing also to some advantages of the attack, such as the possibility of, and also of having mounted forces in that case, because dismounted, you can defend. I mean, cavalry cannot defend by definition, otherwise by becoming infantry. But say, not being able, for example, to pursue the enemy very far, but this is a struggle for survival, and that's what dictates that kind of strategy at the end of the day. We will talk more about the 15th century art of war, because I believe that there is so much misunderstanding, but also like very poor explanation of how it worked the way it did, that people have all these weird kind of explanations, and again, of deterministic nonsense that always accompanies them as a complete denial of strategic culture by definition, because if you think that there is a way to win just per se, it means that you completely have no idea what warfare is, right? Why it is fought to begin with, and what's the role of moral forces in all of this. But no, it must be the Wagenburg and, I don't know, the guns, even though they didn't have much of the latter, nor the Wagenburg was anything better than any other fortification that existed out there. But we'll talk more about this. In any case, already explained in the previous video, in the one about Hussite tactics, and we have all the Hussite battles to reconstruct on Schwerpunkt, except for the ones we already did. With an army made up of Táborites and Praguers, Žižka soon returned to the front lines to lift the siege of Kladruby, one of the forts he had previously garrisoned, by the way, that now the Germans had taken over. I already stressed also the ethnic tensions existing between, say, the Hussites and the Crusaders. Yes, there were Hussites that were of German descent, as many Czechs at the time, so it wasn't much about the 19th century nationalistic sense of ethnic hatred, right? But it did exist to some extent. I mean, having somebody else from the other side of the battlefield that speaks another language, especially has invaded your country from another one, does, of course, play an important role. We already explained this in the previous video. Sigismund has its basis of power in other countries at this point. He wants to, of course, rule over Bohemia, and these guys have exploited the relative political instability of the country to undermine that, like in the international order. Now, upon Žižka's arrival to the war zone, Sigismund retreated first northward, then eastward, eventually making his way back to Hungary. In other words, Žižka managed to scare him off, right? He, in all this, pursued him to the north while also working to clear western and northwestern Bohemia of royalist elements. Those were, again, the most important areas. Bohemia also in later history will be infiltrated in this more sort of northern, eastern, and southern fringe, right? Because it will effectively become a failed state with a lot of, for example, Polish infiltrations. The Poles are technically backing the Hussites at this point against, in fact, the Germans and the Hungarians. But it's not like, and they don't really want to fight against them either when they're asked by the Pope, not because they have much sympathy towards these heretics. There will be some Hussites and Hussite movements present in Poland, but this will be swiftly crushed, of course, by the Polish monarchy, because really nobody needs that destructive rabble, and that's also the civilizational role that these guys really have. You understand how this is also a proxy war of some sort, a struggle between international powers, not just like a local uprising, because, of course, Sigismund of Luxembourg here is the most powerful sovereign in Europe, and he has definitely a lot of enemies, right? He is attracting a lot of envy, etc., and the Hussites, in part, are the response to this in a Czech national but also international fashion. In Tábor, by the way, the fanatics and the moderates in Prague consistently threatened the cohesion of the Hussite movement. These people did not like one another. Prague was a highly civilized place. It had been, as we countlessly explained, the heart of especially 14th century Europe. The establishment was more aware, regardless of these upheavals, the attempt, in fact, of many newcomers to cut heads and seize places, etc. That this prolonged warfare, especially the fanatic ideologism of the more radical Hussites, was damaging, was in many ways outrageous, right? This undermines the Hussite solidity. These groups often found themselves in conflict over practically every topic, such as the same religious practice. Ritual was very important in the entire point of, for example, the Utraquism, but also in much more strictly political terms, like, for example, the treatment of prisoners. The Taborites were much more radical. They just wanted to kill everyone. The Praguers, so to say, were a bit more diplomatic. They understood what could be gained by making leverage on Sigismund through this prisoners, this blackmail. Now, both cities. Now, Tábor was not really something could parallel Prague in precision important, but in terms of the ideological centers, like the political symbols of the respective positions, vied for leadership in Hussite Bohemia at the same time, to the point, of course, of waging independent military campaigns against the different royal towns and forces, which is bad because you have there a theoretically unitary Bohemian potential, but you are acting as two separate bodies in an uncoordinated way. At some point, of course, they would support one another, but they would pursue their own different political and consequently strategical goals. For example, the Tábor faction predominated in the southern western regions, while Prague's residents extended their reach to the north and east, ultimately subduing Kutná Hora, that is, as you know, the purse, like the piggy bank of Bohemia, because it has this fantastic mines of precious metals that really make for a pretty substantial amount of the country's income. This geographical power sharing, however, highlights the fact that Prague was losing to the more radical faction, because Prague is the west and technically the more southwestern, so towards the more civilized part of Germany oriented part of the country, that was instead now infested mostly by the Taborites, so that she has mostly to look to the north and the east that are less civilized places, but at least in this case there are very important economic assets that are key also to funding the war. The Taborites and the Praguers would only consolidate their efforts when faced with clear mutual dangers, of course, like Sigismund's crusades and invasions. There would be some crusades that would basically all fail. And in fact, it would be mostly these two factions that destroyed the Hussite movement, fighting against one another. Naturally, we're oversimplifying things here, but the entire picture is studded with sieges, uprisings, raidings, devastations, disorders, unrest of any kind. During a minor campaign in the south, Žižka was struck by an arrow in his healthy eye. He was already without one, which, by the way, nearly led to his death, because, that at the time, there weren't antibiotics, and this could result in death even for relatively banal accidents, like an arrow in your eye is not really, the most indicative way to hope to survive in terms of wounds you may want to aspire to get. Although he successfully convalesced in Prague, at least for his life, he actually lost his sight completely as well, which made him even more, epic, of course, leading the entire struggle and scoring dramatic victories without both eyes, right? You have some interesting connection in this with John of Luxembourg, the ancestor of the Saint Sigismund that died already blind as an old man at the Battle of Crusade, right, tied to the other men-at-arms, because he was an old man who wanted to fight, and he died there. I briefly talked about this, if anything, in the recent videos made about Charles IV of Bohemia, his son, that also nearly died, like he barely escaped with his life from the same battle. There's also, for speaking about the average nature of power in leadership, right? The kind of responsibility and direct involvement into the military lifestyle. Žižka, as we've seen, was essentially a mercenary. He had fought also abroad. Nothing, he had not earned this enormous reputation as a great commander of large armies, but definitely this was the moment of his further rise and further consolidation of his legion. Despite this, this wound, like, Žižka became a legendary figure, to say the least, known for his ability exactly to turn circumstances around when hope seemed lost, which is one of the most defining traits of a true leader. Meanwhile, Praguer army in the north experienced heavy losses due to their overconfident leader abandoning their supply wagons to confront the advancing German cavalry. The subsistence carts were, of course, necessary for supplying the army, and the more radical Taborites under Žižka's control would have made a much more effective Wagenburg use of it, hopefully. So this was a heavy blow to the general Hussite cause, which was left demoralized after, in fact, their initial significant defeat since the war had started. Žižka then took command of a new Praguer army that had been handed to him in this moment of calamity, with which he headed north, leading to the Germans fleeing at his approach. Even in blindness, Žižka did not rely solely on his fame. He continued to demonstrate exceptional leadership and strategy despite his disability. There is no indication that he operated merely as a figurehead or depended on his lieutenants. Žižka's skills preserved even without his sight, and this is demonstrated just by the continuity, the assiduous presence at the head of the army, the participation, the directness of his orders regarding any strategic and tactical endeavor. That wasn't even the sort of the most difficult aspect of it, but you would think for a blind man, being extremely difficult to remain an authority figure among such hyper-fragmented political front, yet he convinced, also because of his fanatism. He was a Táborite himself, in a ideological sense, that things had to be controlled by him through his supervision. Also putting to death many of his Hussite opponents. By the way, the Adamites, for example, were exterminated later on, etc. From one side, you have this unruly mob of desperate people that at large follow you just because they hope to loot, plunder, rape, destroy, venting their fanaticism and more for whichever sort of twisted worldview. From the other, you have the no less dangerous as competitive men-at-arms that constitute the actual backbone of this force at large, and are at least directed and are always inspiring to rise, in fact, to the top. Žižka manages to keep all these people at bay in spite of his blindness. In 1421, Sigismund, by the way, initiates a second crusade against the Hussites, yet he struggled with effective coordination. Yes, he had the papal support, because otherwise there could have not been a crusade. There is a general international consensus about the necessity of putting down these fanatics. But it's very difficult to fight in Bohemia. It's very difficult to mount up an adequate expedition in Central Europe from bases like the Hungarian or the German one. There are few funds. There is a generally unstable political situation with elective monarchies, with the oligarchies that really are not very inclined to fund major expeditions. This is quite a threatening situation because from one side, yes, the Hussites were dangerous for constituted order, also in other countries. But at the same time, this was really at large a Bohemian thing. And so given the further nationalization of, say, also Central European monarchies, the sense of having to invade one of these lands, unless you wanted really just to, for example, take away chunks of it, as it was partly even happening at a point, especially in areas like Silesia, this would also increase further in time. What was the point, really, right? You could sacrifice this notion of perfectly united Catholic Europe for leaving this rabble of devils ruling their own hellish land. By the way, these campaigns precedents, as we've seen, hadn't been particularly friendly towards the Crusaders, and their hope for fortune and renown here were quite difficult to see. Right? You had, if anything, to pay them, as always, and so also the motivation is tied to that in the end. In August 1421, an army of really consistent amount of German soldiers, again, these are the cases in which you hear 100,000 men, probably not even 20,000, invaded from the west once again. Ahead, by the way, of the king's and his Hungarian forces' preparation. I made a video about the Hungarian army organization of the 14th, 15th century. I talked profusely about German warfare, more or less of the same era. So if you're interested in seeing how these forces would have been put together, you can check those. However, the formula by, say, the later Middle Ages is very clear. There is this bulk, again, of professional troops, and then occasionally, especially if you are fighting with local forces, some militia, right, but not much else. You can have the higher nobility that brings their retinues and pays other infantry, etc. Think about the ranks, like how the general, say, individual men-at-arms were normally served by this point. But, and also this, by the way, in these countries would be likely more contained, like these are relatively more backward areas. And in general, again, the possibility of sustaining these troops for a prolonged time in a region like post-Black Death, Central Europe is pretty difficult on a prolonged basis. By the way, don't underestimate the power of hatred. By the way, the Hussites were routinely raiding into German territory, mostly places like Saxony, Thuringia, Franconia, also Silesia, the northeast. So these places were not really happy with that, but at the same time they didn't have such concentrated forces from, especially the north of Germany, as you know, was less organized, etc. So Sigismund is technically operating from Hungary, plus he has the support in mostly southeast Germany that is more advanced. That's really, in fact, the area that had historically witnessed the development of a German-Czech frontier since the times of, the migration era, the Avars, the Franks, and so on. Looking at this new campaign, the Crusaders enjoyed some initial successes. But during a failed siege, news arrived of Žižka approaching with a formidable Hussite army, and it said that the Crusaders fled swiftly back across the border. Commanding possibly 12,000 or less men, Žižka redirected his focus to Plzeň, a town that was still allied with the Germans. A significantly larger force from Plzeň attacked Žižka's troops, who were strategically situated on the summit of a small mountain called Vlada. Žižka skillfully fended off multiple attacks before managing to escape the Pilsener encirclement and return to Hussite territory. Yet another proof of this important Hussite defensive capacities. Between October and November 1421, Sigismund's part of the crusading army gradually advanced from Hungary through Moravia. This was upsetting, but it was still providing the scattered Hussites with a chance to regroup, as, of course, the Crusaders were mostly involved in sieges that took their amount of time, so leaving the initiative to the enemy, an inferior enemy. Žižka led the Hussite forces to protect, at this point, the newly allied town of Kutná Hora, which the Luxembourg troops approached by the end of December. Very interesting scenario because it highlights how determined both sides were to keep on operating with substantial numbers by the end of autumn, right? And we are looking at, which was atypical, especially in these areas. And so you imagine the effort, imagine the difficulties, imagine the scorched earth, the need to forage in spite of, and also the terrible weather. The landscape is growing ever more grim, and you have pretty sizable forces. This is the moment at which apparently the Crusaders had the greatest force available. Some say 30,000 men, some others say 100,000. Of course, that's nonsense. Probably there were less than 30,000. In any case, the Hussites were considerably less than their opponents. Some said that they were outnumbered 3-1. So we count 10,000 or less Hussites. Žižka used artillery to disrupt the Crusaders' repeated frontal assaults. However, the Hussites could not prevent the Royalists from entering the city of Kutná Hora and surrounding them as darkness set in. Now that night, Žižka executed a surprising attack on the portion of the Crusader camp where Sigismund was stationed himself, successfully breaking free from the encirclement, a noteworthy early example of also an offensive, at least apparently, use of artillery, at least to literally break through a blockade, right? This is really interesting. Like, of course, we should reconstruct it properly from these sources. At this point, Sigismund, who was also exhausted, opted not to pursue Žižka, choosing instead to settle his forces into winter quarters and disperse them among local towns. Also because this enormous forces concentration had become really untenable in those circumstances, especially now that the Hussites had proved their moral force by breaking through the enemy camp at night, also endangering Sigismund's life. So this was really a pretty delicate balance. By the end of January 1422, Žižka gathered reinforcements and launched an unexpected assault on the Crusaders. Sigismund's army, unable to regroup, fled back through the snow towards Moravia. This was a merciless chase. Each time a rear guard attempted to slow the advancing Hussites, they were swiftly overwhelmed. This rout persisted for 3 days, ultimately culminating in the loss of Nemesky Brod a town near southeastern Bohemia's border. This is quite fascinating because it shows how essentially the Crusaders were the stronger force, but they also needed to withdraw for broader strategical and logistical reasons, and the Hussites were on their tail, not because they could simply overwhelm the enemy, but because they could, given the needs of the movements, right, of the army, like to at least attack a smaller portion, having the boldness of attacking the smaller portion with the rear guard. The Crusaders wanted to avoid major confrontation, and they are starting to give way under this relentless pressure, though, because again the odds are fairly balanced now. In the mayhem of the royalist forces fled through Nemesky Broad, hundreds of horsemen fell also through the ice of the Zajava River that runs alongside the town. The Hussite triumph against the Second Crusade that came to an end without having accomplished any major strategic objective diminished the zeal for further invasions among Sigismund's allies. This was the third failed attempt. Although, of course, later crusades were initiated, they quickly lost both enthusiasm and troops, often retreating with little to show for their efforts. Consider that there were major international threats, the Ottoman, for example, one that was pressuring the same Hungary, general issues with the papacy, the relation with these other countries that had been shaky about the recognition of papal authority, were starting even to ride the wave of this populistic, communistic, anti-establishment movements, as long as, of course, didn't threaten them as well. So not really a good situation, as we were saying before. The lack of a genuine external threat to Bohemia now resulted, predictably, in a resurgence of factional disputes among the Hussites, right? Having been fighting for their own survival, other than just their independence. Now the Hussites revealed their true face also among their, co-religionaries, let's put it in this way, and they began to struggle for power over the same kingdom. Žižka eventually departed from Tábor to unite with fervent Hussites in Oreb, where another sect provided with sort of better prospects and general alignment with Žižka's plan. Žižka maintained his tradition of discipline and success in all of this, but factionalism was escalating, and so the situation was going out of hand. Shortly after Žižka's move, Tábor and Prague faced off, yet diplomatic efforts ultimately averted a significant confrontation between these factions, resulting, however, in a split and thus weak country. In 1423, a Hussite force moved southeast into Moravia. However, Žižka was preoccupied with securing a base for his Orebite brotherhood and thus did not join the invasion. The Orebites were pretty extremistic. They were essentially affiliated to the general Taborite position, but were something different, and their prestige stemmed greatly also from their connection with Žižka now. By the way, this expedition was successful in eliminating much of the Crusaders' presence in central Moravia. In the process, the commander of this Hussite force was Divish Borek, a former rival of Žižka, who took the chance to assault one of Borek's castles while he was away. The situation was heating up, especially between the Orebites and the Praguers. Upon returning to Bohemia, Borek confronted Žižka's own troops. However, he suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of the blind warrior. Eventually, a ceasefire was reached, allowing Žižka to continue disrupting Luxembourg's activities, although tensions persisted between the Hussite factions. Žižka's passionate convictions posed numerous challenges for the Hussite movement that was gradually vying for at least a medium-term stability deriving from some kind of international compromise and recognition. As the primary military leader of the uprising, Žižka's advice carried significant influence in this specific matter. Nonetheless, the moderates sought peace and attempted to negotiate with the same Sigismund, which Žižka vehemently opposed. These moderates were backed by Catholics that had remained within Bohemia as well, even though they had really suffered losses within their ranks, and the Praguers even resorted to a failed assassination attempt against him. Žižka's growing reputation gave rise to tales of him waging war in Sigismund's Hungarian lands, yet there is no definitive proof of this. Surely there were raids, there was a situation of permanent instability. Different lords could have surely contributed to the instability of the Bohemian, Hungarian marks, let's say. However, this seems just like the product of the aforementioned state collapse that was happening at the time. It's possible, of course, that the Hussites launched raids into Hungary, but let's say that the voices on Žižka are so running so far and wide that you may never know what's the border between legend and reality. Žižka, however, by this point had really become the principal antagonist of those who wanted a king recognized in Bohemia, prompting them to form alliances with other Hussite factions to redirect their focus against Žižka. This is a very interesting point because throughout all this war there had been, again, some royalist supporters in Bohemia. Generally speaking, the nobler, let's say the higher nobility had been historically from the side of the monarchy, but they had been overrun and decimated. Lots of newly rich newcomers had filled the power vacuum in the worst ways, so the country had not benefited at all. And now the Hussites themselves were starting to feel like the earth sort of falling under their own feet. They had really been the causes of their own crisis, right? And in their incapacity to compromise and to have even any, say, broader political horizon regarding the future of this movement. So the point, if you remember at the beginning, was accepting the monarchy of Sigismund or any other claimant, at least to have a strong man reviving the institutions and the governability of the country. Žižka stood in the way of this. Notably, Prague also allied with Plzeň, that, as we've seen, had always supported Sigismund as a veritable royal stronghold in Bohemia. In fact, many Czech noblemen that supported the monarchic cause had taken refuge in. Together, they amassed an army of over 20,000 troops to pursue Žižka's 7,000 men through central Bohemia, which is, a difficult terrain, eventually trapping him in a location of his choosing as a veritable trap. This is the Battle of Malov that I described. It's one of the few Bohemian battles that I analyzed. In fact, a Hussite one as well. As you notice from that, this is a famous battle because essentially the combined forces had to navigate a valley to reach Žižka's position, and he waited until their forces were split by the valley before launching an attack on their advanced troops, causing them to scatter back into the main body, which resulted in a complete rout. And so here there is this episode in which the Orobites launched their wagons against downhill, literally, against the advancing enemies. You also realize that the numbers were bound, so you always have these voices, at least some accounts that some scholars can use or not. Like if you, for example, look at the mainstream narrative sort of disclosure in books about, say, I don't know, a 200-long book that you can find in part, even digitalized, at least on Google Books without the entirety, but say you can write and find the info yourself, you realize that, this is a legitimate book. it's telling you that the actual truth. But these are just recounting some broader approximation. You won't find, just to tell how it works, Wikipedia, for example, citing them, and not even actually citing the actual, the actual entirety of the original primary sources that they do not know, and that these guys, even in the books, do not really use. And so the notion that, for example, Žižka was so outnumbered all the time, it's actually not quite the case. It's like in other videos, like, I don't know, we discussed the notion that the Mongols, for example, would have had this huge army. It was the case. They were often outnumbered. But also in that case, it's not like they were winning like against opponents who were so many times more than them. So times it could happen. The Hussites had already done that, but at large, the larger the unit, the force, the sort of less this was the case. By the way, now Žižka was surely with less troops than before, and so these clashes were between a few thousands of at least men-at-arms. We know literally nothing sometimes about, for example, the auxiliary complement, the commoners, the infantry. This is the mist, right? I care incredibly about this. This is not just because I do it for a living. I mean, literally reconstructing battles in my publications, but it's like to make you understand that you shouldn't feel ever, I don't know, let's say, embarrassed or by the fact, for example, of not being familiar with historiography, to the extent of presuming that there is this scientific and trying hard to act as if you know about the thing, trying to find information and thinking that you can sort out everything in history. It doesn't really quite work like that. There's certain context, like in this one, just we know that we're not going to find much more about this all, right? It may be that, especially for the later Middle Ages, yes, there's maybe a lost manuscript, an archive document, whatever that can shed more light on a given circumstance, but at large, and especially here, you just know by the general landscape of the sources that's basically it, and that the general fog surrounding these events could hide so much, right, in terms of how things really went, that it's difficult to be definitive even about, for example, this detail of the carts thrown downhill. I discussed this in the video about the Battle of Malov, and we argumented that probably, like, even if this really happened, for example, like, there surely was some broader fighting in this, and that it's possible that the battle went exactly like that, and that they won like that. But the question is also, why didn't they see it coming? What was their general, like, if you have to go uphill against an enemy that you know can throw stuff at you, you didn't naturally do this, right? We may never know, and the actual litmus test to prove, in this sense, at least the relativity of these accounts, is to confront it with other battles and other accounts, and saying, if you are habituated to study, for example, battles that have at least 10 accounts that describe them for medieval warfare, and that are so much better documented to begin with than this. The question is also, you know how the degree by which things can really be different, because you may have an account that says something and another says another thing, but if you read all the 10, you can come to the conclusion that at large there is something that happened in a more specific direction. If you read just one account or two that do not say much about this battle, the level of accuracy that you can hope from the general reconstruction from resting solely on these sources is extremely scarce, and you have to come to terms with that. And usually people who don't is people that just maybe read this for the first time and and they're fascinated, they want to sort of attach an identity pride to the fact that they have learned about the battle, but they literally don't know even how the history of that battle was made. They haven't reconstructed it from the sources. That's really the first step. But also they haven't reconstructed any other battle in the same way. So they literally have no scale or consistency in the world historical problem. Nevertheless, this is an interesting encounter. After Malov, many towns near Prague quickly pledged allegiance to Žižka, instilling fear in the city and prompting a truce offer, by the way. So you see how delicate the situation was. Also the fact that these various Hussite sects did not really have a full control of Bohemia, that was actually more fragmented at this point than it had been in generations, and not definitely for much brighter future at all. In 1424, Žižka formed an alliance with Prague and other Hussite towns to organize a new invasion of Moravia that, as we've seen, held out with a significant royalist presence. In October, the army posed at the Bohemian border to besiege a philo-monarchic town. As usual, that's the proceedings, and you have to stop besieged. There are not many other ways this time in the art of war to proceed. Unfortunately, during this siege, Žižka fell ill, potentially from the plague, we do not know, and ultimately passed away, at least unfortunately for him, not because, here we want him to be the protagonist, but, that he wasn't really probably the best thing that ever happened to his country. By the way, just to tell you that the psychological profile of this person, that was now a battle-hardened veteran, to say the least, and a man of great reputation and charisma, he asked his corpse to be skinned and to make a drum out of his remains, so that he could, with the sound of the instrument, still lead his army, drill his army into battle. And this is, which was granted to him. This wish was satisfied. And so just imagine what this really meant. And here, it's the legend, of course, behind that. I made a video about Walpurgisnacht that talks a bit about Prague, exactly the Hussite revolt, all the blood that permeates metaphysically Bohemia out of this, and the terrible forces that of Gog and Magog that are literally like next door, because that's where essentially the steppes begin outside of the country. And so this fury, this barbaric fury of the East that in part permeated the same Bohemia. I made a video about medieval Bohemian warfare, and we saw how still by the 14th century, Bohemia is fully westernized, military-wise at this point. It's a bit poor, yes, this is true, but together with that comes this slight oriental flavor from the steppe that includes more use of mounted archery, kind of lighter equipment, some kind of very specific Eastern fashion in dress. Like this is even more pronounced in Hungary, for example. But even this land has that folk taste that is really sipped in the blood, right, of, say, the Cumans coming to raid and, still living in market. And so these are the gates of Europe, like of civilized Europe, or at least of the heart of it. And this is important to understand in many ways the spirits, the kinds that are agitating within these people, right? It's practically impossible to draw a psychoanalytical picture of Žižka's, but at the same time, we can sort of, through these anecdotes, real or false, like still understand the general temper of the times. It was definitely not a pretty tender one, and we will see it also in many other videos about the same warfare of the era, right? These are the same years of, at least a few years before the Battle of Azincourt had happened. These are the years to be of also battles like Varna later on, just a couple of decades later. So we're talking about some extremely bloody but also very romantic chivalry, knightly, in part decadent, right? At least as that preeminence of mounted forces were concerned. This is absolutely true. And even though the Hussites had contributed to this as well, they actually didn't stop the preeminence, for example, of mounted combat, right? today we didn't make too much tactical analysis, but the point, as I explained in many videos about late medieval warfare, is that at this point cavalry was still hegemonic, right? Until the mid-15th century in the Swiss, and mostly in a Western context, like the notion that cavalry was outdated, it wasn't even technically there, especially in these areas of Europe. Cavalry, even after the Hussites in the same Bohemia, would remain the upper arm, right? So the circumstances why the Hussites managed to succeed, as we've seen, with mostly foot or dismounted forces, did not, for example, first of all, sort of deny the fact that they did fight mounted, by the way, as well, but also that think England, like other armies, like it's not like they fought only on foot all the time, or if they did so by prevalent, like that's the case of England. It's not like they wouldn't fight mounted at the same time, and there are very specific, often political, even before then, strategic reasons. I described this in the video about the tactics of the Wars of the Roses. But in France, cavalry is the first. In Spain, cavalry is the first. In Italy, cavalry is the first. In Germany, cavalry is the first. In Scandinavia, cavalry is the first. In Hungary, cavalry is the first. And in Bohemia, cavalry is the first. In Poland, in Lithuania, in Ruthenia. You can't hide this. The notion that cavalry was outdated is false for these years, and especially it's not like simply the Hussite system that was even aiming at that, right? If the Hussites had had enough backbone for cavalry, given that they had been deserted by the higher nobility that fought mostly like that, they would have used it. They weren't dumb, right? It's just their specific political and social circumstance, not the pre-gressed like doctrinal choice to do so for any specific scientific reason in the art of war, right? So the fact that, again, Žižka's Orebites flay his skin to create drum heads for their army, so that the mere presence of Žižka in that form could send many armies into retreat, I think in the general picture is much more powerful than any kind of technical consideration of Wagenburgs, of guns, by the way, that were very scarce in the area to begin with. Actually, one of the reasons why the Crusaders, so the German, mostly German, but also Hungarian knights, etc., also other Bohemians, were crushed on horseback against the Hussite Wagenburg, is the actual lack in the Central European armies of enough artillery. We have seen this also in the video about the armies of the German peasant revolt at the beginning of the 16th century, 1524-25. Even for the imperials, the Habsburgic forces, also the ones funded by the ones of the Swabian League, funded by the Fugger, by the greatest bankers of the time, and we're talking southern Germany, by the way, was the most advanced part of Germany, it was really prohibitive to field particularly large amounts of guns to begin with. And most of the army, including the ones that arrive from Lorraine, etc., are mostly still medieval. They have like 1/3 of knights and 2/3 of infantry. In northern Germany, that's even more the case. Bohemia fits this as well in general. And so you realize that the Hussites are not the thing that has been presented to you. Oh my god, let's make an experiment. Let's search for this stuff on YouTube. Just to say what better what we're talking about here. Like Hussite tactics, Let's search Hussite infantry. Because, or Hussite cavalry. Let's say Hussite cavalry and explain now why. Challenge to, okay, this is the crucial point. The Wagenburgs are, I'm not saying which kind of channel it is, but these are the most famous ones, right? So here, 60 peasants versus 8,000 crusaders. This is, of course, like a random guy, nothing particularly serious Here they even copied. Wow, there is one channel. I just discovered a channel essentially plagiarizing another. Well, very interesting. I hope it doesn't happen with mine. Hussite infantry. How the Hussite stuff were operated. Well, there isn't too much about cavalry. The medieval tank, right? The ultimate knight's nightmare, the Wagenburg. My eyes, right? Again, this is what I said all the time, had the Hussite Wagenburg taken the field of France or Italy, or even certain parts of Germany, would have been destroyed to pieces by that fire, right? There is my video, Hussite tactical satisfaction. Very few views, but it's still there, and it's not. I presume it's not showing up because I'm using my own account right now. Well, okay, there isn't actually even much about Hussites, as I thought there would be. But in any case, you see here the focus is, there is nothing about any other general topic. It is true that Hussites would fight like that, but at large, there doesn't seem to be any other hint at, I don't know, let's talk about this in a dry way. Let's talk about the general army organization. Let's not put this freaking Wagenburg at the center all the time. I'm probably going to use it in my own thumbnails as well. But, for example, here, unrelated, but Black Army of Hungary. In order to provide these damn titles that have to galvanize people for some of the most sought after mercenaries of Europe. First of all, the Black Army, yes, there were mercenaries because there were soldiers. At large, we'll talk about this, but what does it mean, the most sought? Right, this was technically the army of the King of Hungary, right? So it's not like they were sought after, because there is this notion that the mercenary sought because you have to overly emphasize the concept of mercenary and people wanting them because it's a mercenary. No, these were how normally soldiers were used in any other country, and they were just a good force among the top of the time, but because they were part of a big country that was well armed. And again, other countries had comparable forces, but you have to make the sensationalism. You add some of the most, because of course nobody says like the Hungarian Black Army is the best army of the period, but let's say, what's the point of this title with the merge? Just say the Hungarian Black Army, say something else, like add as I use some sort of citation, some sort of thing that sends chills down your spine, but this kind of sort of popularizingly inform how people are supposed to evaluate in a categorical sense certain armies that were at large the same as basically everybody else had, is too much. And even in the case of the Hussites that are a bit more eccentric for sure, still it's not like you can this thing of the Wagenburg has to take over the entirety of this of the Hussite military merit, right? Let's talk about what they were motivated by, what kind of tactics they enacted, because they even didn't fight, of course, just with Wagenburgs to begin with. So that becomes a meme, and it's fine if it can propagate, because it makes, say, this army easier to remember. But at the same time, it's not entirely that. If you stop to that, you're basically depriving the audience even of that critical capacity to, develop a more intelligent and less deterministic and technologistic explanation for explaining why an army is good. The Hussite ones were, right? In any case, following Žižka's passing, just to go back on track, the Hussites continued to secure victories. It's not like it ended there. It was just about Žižka, right? Relying, however, heavily on his tactics and legacy at large. So when you have a winning team, you sort of don't change it, even when the captain dies. Now, the Orebite Brotherhood, known as the Orphans now after Žižka's death, became the most feared among the Hussite forces. You know, they had the famous Christian symbol of the pelican, that is the mom pelican that eats her own chest to feed the baby. This is for part of the of the bestiaries, and also sort of the Christian iconography of the time. It signified in many ways also the same Žižka, like the same fatherly connection that existed between him and his children, right? And independently, separate Hussite groups achieved notable victories against the Germans, the Austrians, at least in the sense that now we're starting to differentiate these provinces in a feudal sense, in a sort of more political fashion. The Hussites advanced, as we were saying before, in northern, central, and southern German regions in all of this. They, some say, but this is actually not true, that they pushed north toward at least the Baltic Sea and west into Hungary. As we've seen, these are basically some, not even hypotheses, they're rumors, right? But they're fitting the general disorder of the situation, right? In fact, ultimately, despite their string of successes, the Hussites were undermined by this internal division that brought them really nowhere. On the contrary, now their enemies were increasing. Also, the international situation was normalizing. The papacy was consolidating its grip, like after some problems. The same empire was readjusting. However, a critical clash occurred on June the 16th, 1434, at Lipany. This clash is essentially the end of the most fanatic branch of the Hussites' relevance, right? It's a battle between the moderate Hussites, the so-called Calixtines, that essentially include the Praguers, the Hussite nobles, but also Bohemian Catholics, forces from the St. Eugene, also from the Wittigonen/Rosenberg. This was a powerful clan that had historically fought against the monarchy, but now against the Hussites had, of course, sided also with it. There were the Prager, some other towns like such as Melnik. Is not too important, against the radicals, against essentially the Táborites and the orphans. This clash is putting an end, in fact, to the latter faction, right? The conservatives triumphed by drawing Žižka's former followers out of their fortified positions, which proved fatal. Now look at this very famous clash. That is a bloodbath. All right, this is the force. Like we were talking about 2,000 dead out of 10,000 from the radical side. So that is a very heavy blow. It's sufficient to sort of melt it away. The enemies were likely something like 14,000. These are the largest forces that can be put together by the Bohemians at large, because now these are the two main sides of the country. This battle does allow the Hussites to reobtain some kind of broader legitimacy, because the conservative element that wants a monarch that is seeking for general stability now prevails. But it's also a heavy blow, because Bohemia was sheltered in part by the same radicals. By 1436, the Hussites strike a deal with Sigismund that died a year later. It's basically the end of the Luxembourgs, and that changes a lot of things. Like the subsequent reigns are in Bohemia the ones of Albert of Austria, that last couple of years between 1437 and 1439, then Ladislas Posthumus, 1439, 1457. These are father and son. They share the sum of crowns that was typical of Central Europe at this time. So essentially they are kings of Bohemia in this case, but are also kings of the Romans. they're kings of Hungary, so they have a control over Germany, over this other Central European monarchies, and the reason being that they're not entirely successful in any of these countries. At least they have largely to concentrate their attention on just one of them, and Bohemia is the less appealing in that regard because of the war that has literally ravaged the country, has basically destroyed it and weakened it sensibly, so that now these guys are now the consequence of the same Bohemian exhaustion, right? That continues further under their reigns, though. Most of these monarchs had just a predatory mindset, or at least they were trying to squeeze the most out of the locals against the recognition of the nobility or the oligarchic prerogatives in the country. So these reigns, we will see them surely at some point, were marked by incompetent regencies, civil unrest, political collapse, right? Ultimately, in 1448, the Hussites elevated one of their own. That is George of Podebrady. This guy is strange because he is technically a heretical king, one of thoroughly important monarchies in Europe. He is famous also in this time, consider the years here, like Constantinople has fallen, right? So the he proceeded as a regent in Bohemia. In 1459 he declared himself king, and he began to write about the necessity of all the Christians to unite against the common threat of the Turk, that of course he sort of didn't care too much about, because you had still Hungary in between, and Bohemia would not really be touched by the Ottoman invasions later on. But that was just a sort of distraction, an attempted distraction directed at the other rulers in Europe, all Catholic rulers, I would like to stress, surely not heretical to that extent, because there were also the Orthodox from the other side. It's another story. Distracting from the fact that he was in fact an heretic on the throne, and there is all a huge hypocrisy also because, as you know, Europeans after 1453 are starting to freak out, but they are not doing too much telling Israel, because they starting to, like 1456, there is all Hunyadi, Capistrano, there are all the siege of Belgrade, and these are moments in which actually the Christians, like in many others, could have simply marched on Constantinople had they been successful in a battle or two still. So there was nothing really deterministic in the Ottoman expansion. It derived from specific faults, from lack of action, right? It made different videos about the period. If you check the 15th century playlist, you will find that. George of Podebrady was not even just such a great guy. Under his reign, there was yet another civil war, which brought to the Hungarian invasion that literally stripped some territories from the crown. Silesia is infested, collapsing. It's really a mess. We've seen it in different videos. We'll keep talking about this further, because it's a very interesting and dark period. It shows you the degree by which Bohemia had collapsed. I don't remember, actually. I think I made this already. Well, never mind. But we discussed it, and we've also seen which conditions, like Bohemia was in the 16th century, like the degree of sort of really of decay, of advanced decay of the actual of the crown lands, especially in the fringe outside, because the crown of Bohemia, as you know, had actually included also other lands like Silesia, Sorabia, etc. I think I made... No, I think I still have... Yeah. Now, we actually have to make 15th century Bohemian video, but we already discussed this at some point. Yes, I think in the video about Silesia itself. So we need the 15th century videos because they arrived last in the cycle. In any case, stay tuned because we will get there more in depth. This, by the way, so the Hussites had their own king now, but this civil war, just showing how the country was not capable of handling itself after the destructions of the war, basically brings to collapse. Like the same Hussite front became splintered by 1471. You gotta admit it lasted for a while, but the country was completely done. And so there is hardly, and that's the point, by the way, when things end, because the Hussites are they're done, right? There is some Protestant continuation afterwards, so that the bridges of this movement, the theological implications of Jan Hus were very similar to the ones of Luther, right? So the bridges are not cut. Many Hussites are, however, expelled from the country. They end up in Germany, where they surely contribute in turn, in fact, to produce those like the ones of Luther, especially this violent, but it was not really Luther's, but still entailed in a broader sense by disregard to word tradition and Catholicism, like disregard against authority, let's be honest, against the establishment, etc. That was the point. Largely, the Hussites had communistic tendencies, and I already made multiple videos about heretics and what it meant to fight against Catholicism to begin with, the deep theological, psychological, human reasons why that happens. So as I was saying at the beginning of the other video, if it is true by some degree that 4 generations, Western historians especially, the leading ones, like in the West broadly speaking, so in the world, tended to focus on French and English warfare because of the 100 Years' War, and as a consequence the Hussites were sort of neglected to a historiographical degree. I think that the general attention towards the Hussites, at least the attention is good, right? The more attention, the better. Like, even if it were still about Azincourt, the 100 Years' War, the rise of the Habsburgs, let's say the Swiss Confederates, the Ottoman invasions, etc., were, fine. The more attention towards any historical topic is fine. I personally like Hussite history. I think it's very bitter, it's very painful, and horrendous, but it's also beautiful, paradoxically, exactly because of it, because it teaches you so much, and it shows, right, really, some of these battles are very inspiring, are very beautiful to study, are very, they make you think about tactics, about the art of war. But the point I was making is that this revival towards the Hussites, I think, was a bit excessive. I don't know how it happened, really. Some of you have also spoken their mind about this. They said maybe this is an attention towards the Protestants, this proto-Protestant movement. So, which is something that I said myself actually in the video, and the fact that this sort of popular. Mostly, this is what I emphasize. The need to say that the people win over the elites. This is actually one the greatest examples of how the people went nowhere. Actually, they made things far worse for everybody, including themselves. They lost everything, and a foreign domination was fully installed in Bohemia, and that didn't reacquire, in fact, independence in this sense until the 20th century. And I would say that these ideological reasons are in fact pretty lame. But the level of sensationalization of Hussite warfare is very strange to a degree. At least it always struck me how, especially from books, like you have these summaries of how medieval warfare was, and yes, like half of the book is about English warfare, because of course these are British publications that are in other countries do not do that, right? At least they do not write them in English. They don't have authors sort of lending themselves to explain in part also because continental Europe studied a bit less of this military history due to the fact that it, say World War II and the fact that at least more or less continental Europe had less mood, let's say, less motivation to talk about war in general, and that was actually bad, telling you the truth. But in this sense, you always find the chapter dedicated to the Hussites, and barely any chapter about sort of other ongoing, military systems that deserve much more credit. In, if anything, because they were fully fledged, like the top devil ones at the time. But the average Hussite army was just like 6,000 men. It is true that, say, at this time, like armies were not particularly big, especially compared to the 13th century. But in that sense, like how much space does the Battle of Markfeld, 13th century Bohemia, have in those kind of books compared to the Hussites? It was more sort of conventional warfare compared to other European areas. But let's say, I think that some country, would us talk about 15th century Germany? No one, all right? At least, I don't know, the Condotta in Italy, or the 100 Years' War in France, something partly about the Reconquista, especially the final stages of the Siege of Granada are there. But let's say there was much more warfare going on, especially in the western portion of Europe. And let's say this Hussite fits maybe, I don't know, a divertissement, but it can't be just about that. Like the hyper sort of attention towards them is probably to be investigated in more culturally perceptive terms. As you see here, I covered them. Like this is a special, for example. Like I could have chosen another topic, but I liked, of course, to talk about the Hussites, and we will, as always, keep it. Say I've never refrained by saying that we'll never talk about the Hussites. We shouldn't give them credit or publicity. Absolutely not. Why would I do that? Like it's absolutely, it has nothing to do with what I want. I just want you to have a proportion of how and why we should consider military systems of one kind or another, and their relative importance, but also their absolute importance. And as you know, on Schwerpunkt we reason, at least at the European scale, so that this meaning at large is about the Hussites being part of European warfare, and so they're interesting, especially when you read them in function of this. As with all warfare, you can extend to the world, right? But one thing at a time. Schwerpunkt is still young to an extent. In fact, the Hussite legacy is much more powerful. Like literally, as I was saying before, in terms of the art of war, you can't say that, I don't know, the Hussite Wagenburg went nowhere. Like we've seen it also among the German peasants during the 16th century uprising. They were exterminated, right, pretty badly. Like you have, by the way, the Wagenburg existed in other countries as well. We've seen Žižka likely got this mostly from maybe the Lithuanians, this peoples that habitually made more use of it, like the Ruthenians, etc. As he fought in Poland against the Teutonic Knights as well. And so there is some kind of connection there. But the point I was making is that the Hussite uprising set some sort of stage for the Reformation in terms of insurrectional, capacity. Like the Hussites proved that you could take up arms against the emperor, against the church. You could challenge them, at least. They lost, or at least they actually, the universal powers gave up to a degree, because they realized also these Hussites were not going anywhere. There wasn't really a spillover of Hussitism. This is very interesting, because yes, again, some went to Poland, some to Germany, but it's not like they really constituted like a international movement of sort. There was that general equation of these heretics Europe-wide, because more or less the dynamics are always the same. Like today, there are some movements that are cross national, right? And they express some kind of malaise or whatever, and they are surely looking at one another. But this was not the time yet for this to go anywhere practically. If anything, there is also a Czech national meaning to all this that, however, ended in disaster and tragedy. So that there is literally also Czech diaspora, at least to some extent, bringing the seeds of this rebellion against authority elsewhere, right? Almost internationalizing the rebellion. Žižka's military strategies are important because they show, also from a tactical point of view, that yes, like a very good use of defensive position, improvised fortifications, supported at close range by some artillery. It wasn't a game changer, like crossbows were more important than missile weapons in that case, but let's say to shatter close range cavalry charges arriving against these fortifications that knights were, by the way, trained to take on, right? Knights were the stormtroopers in siege warfare. It's not like, the Wagenburg was anything particularly impressive in that regard. But in the way, of course, there were people manning it, defending it. Like, that's the most important side of the story. You can realize how powerful the Hussites were from a moral point of view. Other than that, do they have any transformative military system that reforms the say European warfare? No, right? It doesn't change really anything in the bigger picture, nor Bohemia has any significant future with this kind of tactics. They were just contingent to the fact that this army was often on the move, but especially, like, there wasn't even much of that nomadism, like, inside. It's just that they were often in numerical inferiority, and they tended to exploit everything they had at their disposal, including these mobile fortifications. It's like when, similar to the concept of the pavis that sometimes is also associated, look, the Bohemians used the pavis, like, yes, like all the rest of Europe, and without any particular, by the way, function of the pavis compared to other shields before, and much categorism and technologism is made about that too as well. But say pavises were also used, at least there is a point at which this transforms into some kind of fixed fortification shield, right? And the limit does not essentially change the nature of the stuff, right? They're not special weapons, they're not game changers. It's always the moral force behind these objects that makes the difference, right? Do the wars fought by Žižka and his Hussite force signify the conclusion of medieval warfare and heralded new forces that would reshape the world? I don't see that, right? Also because this is a purely medieval system, right? There isn't even... Actually, in the way it is more international before, as we've seen, because there are still men-at-arms that lead to dances, etc. Yes, it's mostly a peasant revolt, right? Also, the commoners are the majority, etc. But still, there is some kind of mounted forces as well. We've seen it also in the last showdowns among Hussites themselves. No, there aren't new forces in this sense, if not from an ideological point of view. If anything, the new forces of the Renaissance are forces of the same princes and kings and emperors that the Hussites were fighting. Those are the forces that will dictate battlefield conditions. Excuse me, I drink a little. Paradoxically, the pike square will be created, yes, by other opponents of monarchic forces that will, however, lend themselves to the most monarchic regime in Europe, that is France. But in any case, these fade also because they are composed exclusively of, or virtually exclusively by infantry, about pikemen. or at least like heavy infantry, I mean. While the pike and shot system entails the missile element, it's a large-scale force. It costs an enormous lot, like meaning an entire pike square was large as the average Hussite army alone, and this was still assisted by cavalry, artillery, and that's a completely different way of making war. That has nothing to do with a bunch of beggars entrenching behind wagon carts because they literally have nothing better to hide from. It literally doesn't make any sense. Like this tactic doesn't replicate itself in the future. If anything, it's still in use from, later on, as it had been from millennia, way before the Hussites, in Eastern Europe mostly. The Hungarians use it against the Ottomans for a while in the later generations. You can argue that was a Hussite legacy, but it was because it was Hungary and Central Europe and the Balkans. You don't find this. Actually, you find it elsewhere. I mean, wagon forts were used even, I don't know, by the Italians in the 12th century in the Po Valley. Like, it's not something that pertains to any specific territorial reality, mostly since there are lots of open plains in the large swathes of the Eastern European steppes. If you're caught out there in the open, you have no better protection, you will use that. It's still done with pickups, with trucks out there in the deserts, in other places today. So it has nothing to do with any specific invention that the Hussites bring further. There is no military system or reform that basically, like the Hussites start. They never tried. They didn't have any intention of that. They just fought with what they had, and they stayed at that. Right? Had they had a better army, they would have used that instead of the Wagenburg, with of course more results. Bohemia is also destroyed after this attempt. So there is really, like, this is a completely, again, be serious type and way of war. Right, the true way of war is paradoxically the one of the defeated here, of Sigismund's paid men-at-arms, lances, that are defeated by the Hussites, but are not defeated in the world, say even in Hungary or the same Bohemia. The Bohemians will keep fighting themselves with heavy cavalry first and infantry later. Infantry forces in this sense will develop more in Western Europe than in Central Europe. So, including against the effectiveness against cavalry. So, this has, and it has nothing, again, it's an open field, larger scale force. It has nothing to do with this defensive approach. On the contrary, the square is offensive. Something that the Hussites, by definition, wouldn't do. Because, first of all, they didn't have a square, they didn't have the collective training, the resources, the state for achieving that, but entrenching yourself into a wagon fort is the proof that you must at least tactically defend. Yes, it is true that the wagon fort was, for example, deployed at some point to advanced positions, but the point was always defending from it, and there is actually no proof that it was ever used, let's say, in a attacking fashion. I mean, of course, how do you even do it? Like, it's not, you can move this. You even have, like, where do you place the horses? You know, to be slaughtered by the enemy. It doesn't work like that. So again, great resistance, great political defiance, great military results, but not because of this specific invention, so to say. This is incredibly important to understand. I can't stress it enough. Like, I say it because at least it's my impression that the Hussites are misrepresented and brought on before as a typical allegedly typical example of the infantry revolution, all this pile of BS that has no place in the annals of the art of war, and that, I don't know, people seem to be attracted to an irresistible degree, which is sort of upsetting in many ways. And again, if you say the only type of criticism that I ever met when coming to this point was something like I mean, I've never personally met criticism actually on my channel regarding these topics, because I never said, but people literally reason in terms of, that team won or that other lost, right? It's not like they have a contextual, relative approach to this, to the degree you can explain how a particular military culture developed, or how a war unfolded, or comparing it to other countries. Zero. I've never found that anywhere. I just found this over-representation, I would say. That's it. It's not even anything wrong. And people probably realize that others are, that are sometimes too zealotic. We've seen it before, also in our YouTube search, quick YouTube search about the same issue. It's just an interesting topic. It's relevant for 15th century warfare, but at large. It's also probably not adequately studied. I would like to contribute to this on Schwerpunkt, and in fact we are going to do so, if time allowing, and I'm always eager to, of course, cover everything as possible, because these are, at least I don't think anybody is going to really do it otherwise. Like, I have this kind of impression that at large, the strangely enough, the potential here for making videos has increased, but it's not being fully exploited. There is a lot of AI, there is a lot of weird sort of as you've seen before, we spotted a case of plagiarism right off the bat, but what can you do? It's also like how the system works. Plagiarism is a real issue, because it seems like I even wonder, like, how does it work? Like, if somebody plagiarizes your video, like, how do you I would fear that YouTube to go crazy and take out my own videos. I mean, not really, but not like they're confused about whose videos that, but in the sense that, I don't know, this guy signaling is a troublemaker. Like, and I probably wouldn't. But the point is that this stuff is nothing but increasing, obviously, in time, and somebody should check with a bit more of assiduity and do something, because I don't even for complete removal, but people should be shamed in a way. And in any case, what else could we add here? Not much. I again am pretty satisfied with the general trend of the channel. I think for some reason we're doing something right recently, and I've seen views going up. There is a general, let's say, interest in the channel. Sometimes it's difficult to keep the growth sustained, but this is also up to you. It's a matter of constance and dedication, however you feel these towards the channel. I think at large Schwerpunkt does have a great potential that is worth passing into action, and it does pass mostly through a military historical analysis. Sometimes I have the impression I may be talking a bit too often about topics that are not really that are veering away from military history. It's difficult to talk about military history. I'm not even sure that people are so interested, telling the truth. In part because I'm rambly and I make all this criticism, but I think that's also necessary to a degree. On the other side, I think that it's a bit too difficult. Like, people do not really want to be challenged, and military history is challenging to a degree that very few other topics can definitely equate to. So my impression, if anything, is that there is a lot of sense, okay, well, why should I learn about this, right? I already heard that. No, I think that military, I feel that, like, if it depended on me, probably would, I could have at least been a different type of historian. I could have done something else, but I think I realized this only through military history. I think military history was the actual gateway to a big deal of other content, about other topics, of other themes that I could present, right? I learned something new every day, and I think that military history is the topic that can give you more than the others in this sense. And also the religious spin-offs, like the general political understanding of the world, I think it comes primarily through this military historical understanding. There's a lot to do. Like, it feels hard to really be after yet the next military historical topic. It's important to talk history in general, otherwise you give no context. In fact, I shall start a modern contemporary history video series, because otherwise it's impossible to substantiate other inquiries. I don't know YouTube's future. I don't know how this is all going to work, but I hope that this is going to remain, that it's going to be, that we're going to have an important reach still over the years. And it depends on you. Like, we are at 25,000, by the way, thank you for that. And that's an important number. It's not that much, but it's again, it's been increasing. In the last couple of days, we made this 150 subscribers. The channel could grow faster, that's true, but it's going to grow faster over time because of this. And I discovered that people are ever more, like, they're getting affection to this channel. Like, they are starting to understand the potential of this all, because I realized up to a couple of years ago it would have not been so evident what I was doing. Now the numbers, the themes, etc., these are really all relevant enough. Like, they're well intertwined. The face of this all is really emerging more directly. And I have a lot of new stuff that I think you're going to like coming up soon. Very well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.